Hey everyone, this is Zach with 8020 Media, here today with a video on the BMW B46 versus B48 engines. The difference between the B46 and B48 engines is actually very simple. The BMW B48 is a standard engine code and the one that most people predominantly use when discussing either the B46 or the BMW B48 engine. But ultimately, the real difference between these two engines and the different engine codes boils down to emission standards. So the normal BMW B48 engine meets ultra low emissions vehicle standards, so it's considered ULEV or ULEV. On the other hand, the BMW B46 is a SULEV vehicle or super ultra low emissions vehicle. So the B46 essentially just meets stricter emissions requirements. Here in the United States, the B46, the SULEV variant of the engine, is actually the predominant engine and really the only one found here in the United States and North America. Most of the rest of the world receives the BMW B48 engine, which has the more lenient emissions requirements. So it used to be in the past that these SULEV vehicles were primarily sold in California. However, BMW, likely in an effort to stop dealing with multiple markets within the US itself, decided to simply offer a super ultra low emissions vehicle for the entire United States and North American markets, which is why we receive predominantly the B46 engine around here, and the rest of the world receive the B48 engine. That difference in the emission standards that these engines meet is really the only significant difference. Mechanically, the B46 and B48 are almost identical engines. Now, there are a couple differences, of course, to enable the B46 to meet the stricter emissions requirements and be considered a super ultra low emissions vehicle. However, they are very minor. Finding all of these minute and small changes between the B46 and B48 can be complicated. Unfortunately, unlike with the N20 versus N26, a very similar situation with the ULEV versus SULEV vehicles, there was a little bit more information with those N20 versus N26 available, and it's likely the B46 and B48 have some similar differences, with one of those being sorted fuel injectors. So what BMW did with the N20 and the N26 is the N26 was the super ultra low emissions vehicle. BMW actually tested all of the injectors, and all of the best performing fuel injectors with the least amount of leakage were actually used on the BMW N26 engine. So would assume that something similar is going on with the BMW B48 and that is receiving some of those sorted fuel injectors on the B46, the super ultra low emissions vehicle. But ultimately, outside of that, really the biggest difference just boils down to the catalytic converter and Otto particulate filter, or OPF, sometimes also known as a gasoline particulate filter. Here in the US and North American markets where we receive the B46, that is going to have slightly more restrictive catalytic converters on the engine compared to the Otto particulate filters found in the European and other spec B48 engines. So that is going to be one main difference, and that is why if you do look for downpipe upgrades for the B46 and B48, you will see that the fitment of the downpipes is actually different between those two engines, and that boils down to those differences in the catalytic converters. Also, there were a couple additional changes on the BMW B46 with the fuel system and fuel lines, really just to reduce the chance of any fuel leaks or issues there, all in order to help the vehicle meet super ultra low emissions vehicle standards. Otherwise, even though there are some differences, you may think if the catalytic converters are more restrictive and the B46 is needing to meet these stricter emissions requirements, that there would be a performance difference between the two engines. However, there is not. The B46 and the B48 deliver the exact same power, the exact same torque. They have the same power and torque bands and really feel and respond the exact same way. So there's not any considerable difference between the B46 and the B48, except for the fitment of a couple parts, like what I mentioned with the downpipes. Turbocharger fitment is also a little bit different between the B46 and B48, and so that's another difference. So it is important for a couple of those things, but when it comes to performance or really anything else, there isn't any notable reason to think that the B46 or B48 is a better engine. However, it is still helpful to know exactly which engine you have in the case of looking for certain parts where you may not know if you have a B46 or B48, but you need a certain fitment depending on that. So how do you know if you have the BMW B46 or B48 engine in your vehicle? That's going to be as simple as using a VIN decoder. Putting your VIN number into one of these decoders will return that information as to whether you have the B46 or B48. Another quick and easy way to check is under the hood there should be an emissions sticker, and that will show either ULIV, ultra low emissions vehicle, or SULIV on it. And depending on what you have, you can then figure out whether you have the B46, again the super ultra low emissions vehicle, or the B48, which would just show ULEV or ULIV standards. So two quick easy ways to figure out whether you have the B46 or B48 there. Check that emissions sticker, otherwise put your VIN into a VIN decoder and that will spit out what you have, whether that be the B46 or B48. So again, really just matters for fitment of a couple components. Otherwise, the B46 and B48 are mechanically identical. They offer the same exact power, performance, specs, everything there. And when it comes to aftermarket potential, both of the engines are equally as capable. And really, as you start doing some upgrades like to the downpipes, for example, then the engines become even more similar than they already are. That wraps up our video for today. If you guys appreciated the content, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and check out the description below for more. Thanks, everyone.